I never imagined how one moment could change everything. It started with a single knock on the door, and before I knew it, my nephew had uncovered a truth I wasn't ready to face. What happens when the boundaries of family and trust blur into something unexpected? How far can you go before there's no turning back? Before we dive into this intense story, make sure you're subscribed to the channel for more gripping tales just like this one. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from today? I'd love to hear your thoughts as we navigate this unforgettable journey together. When I turned around and saw my nephew standing in the doorway, his wide eyes staring back at me, I felt like the ground beneath me had given way. His jaw tightened, and the unspoken question hung in the air like an unbearable weight. What he thought he had walked into, I wasn't sure, but the tension was palpable. My hands trembled as I tried to adjust my blouse, my heart racing uncontrollably. "Stephen," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. But he didn't wait for an explanation. He turned and walked out, leaving the door ajar. My chest heaved, and the silence he left behind roared louder than any confrontation could have. Earlier that week, life had seemed so much simpler. My nephew Stephen had just moved back to our small town to start a new job after graduating from college. With his youthful energy and infectious smile, he brought a kind of vibrancy that my life, and this house, hadn't seen in years. I had invited him to stay for a few weeks while he got settled, a suggestion my husband Tom was more than happy to approve. Tom worked long hours and was often away, so the company was welcome. Besides, Stephen had always been like a son to us after his parents passed away when he was young. On Monday morning, Stephen arrived with his usual charm, hauling his suitcases into the guest room. He greeted me with a warm hug, his scent a mix of fresh cologne and something uniquely him. "Aunt Lucy, it's so good to be home," he said, his voice tinged with genuine affection. "You know you're always welcome here," I replied, patting his back. But as I stepped away, I noticed something I hadn't before, a subtle shift in how he looked at me. His eyes lingered just a moment longer than they should have. I brushed it off, blaming my imagination. I'd been feeling a little self-conscious lately, what with Tom always gone and my 50th birthday looming over me like a dark cloud. Stephen's presence, however, was a distraction I desperately needed. The days passed uneventfully at first. Stephen would head out during the day to his new job and return in the evenings, brimming with stories about his coworkers and office politics. We would sit on the porch with glasses of iced tea, laughing at his impressions of his boss or reminiscing about his childhood antics. One evening, as the sky turned shades of amber and pink, Stephen asked, "Why don't you do more for yourself, Aunt Lucy? You've always been so talented. Why not start painting again?" I glanced at him, surprised by his observation. "Oh, I don't know. Life gets busy, and I suppose I forgot about it." "Well, you shouldn't," he said firmly, his eyes holding mine. "You're too good to let that go." His words struck a chord in me. It had been years since anyone, not even Tom, had noticed the small dreams I'd shelved away for the sake of practicality. Stephen's encouragement, however innocent, felt like a lifeline. The first hint of something more came 2 nights later. Tom had called to say he'd be working late again, and Stephen offered to help me tidy up the attic. It was a daunting task I'd been putting off for months, and I appreciated his eagerness. The attic was dusty and cluttered with memories, old photo albums, Christmas decorations, and boxes of keepsakes I'd long forgotten. As we worked, we stumbled across a box of my old paintings. Stephen's face lit up as he pulled out one of my landscapes, the colors faded but still vibrant. "These are incredible," he said, holding up a canvas. Why would you ever stop? His genuine admiration made my cheeks flush. Life gets in the way, I said lightly, though my voice faltered. Stephen studied the painting a moment longer before setting it aside. You shouldn't let it. You still have time, you know. Something in the way he said it made my stomach flutter, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. I quickly pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to my own insecurities and a misplaced desire for validation. The next morning, the air between us felt different. There was a certain warmth in Stephen's demeanor, a kindness that felt almost intimate. Over breakfast, his compliments about my cooking felt more personal, his smile lingering a bit too long. I told myself I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew something had shifted. That evening, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, Stephen came in, his shirt damp from a run. He leaned against the counter, watching me as I diced vegetables. You work too hard, Aunt Lucy, he said, his voice low. You deserve someone who notices that. I froze for a moment, the knife hovering over the cutting board. That's sweet of you to say, I replied, avoiding his gaze. But when I turned, I found him closer than I expected. His hand brushed mine as he reached for a glass, and the electricity of that brief touch sent a shiver through me. My heart raced, and I felt a flush creeping up my neck. I think I'll go take a shower, he said, his voice soft but deliberate. As he walked away, I stared after him, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. It was Friday afternoon when everything came to a head. I had just finished a workout and was in the den, stretching on a yoga mat, when I heard Stephen come home early. I didn't think much of it until I looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. His gaze was intense, and I realized with horror that my posture, innocent as it was, could be misconstrued. I quickly adjusted, sitting upright, but the look on his face told me it was too late. Stephen, I said, trying to sound casual, I didn't hear you come in. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. I didn't mean to interrupt, he said, but there was something in his tone that unsettled me. You're not interrupting, I said quickly, reaching for my towel. I was just finishing up. But as I stood, his eyes locked onto mine, and I saw something there I wasn't prepared for. A mix of curiosity and something darker. It was then that I realized I was in over my head, and this moment, whatever it was, had the potential to change everything. Stephen didn't leave the room, and the intensity in his gaze lingered like an unanswered question. I clutched the towel in my hand, using it as a makeshift shield, though I wasn't sure what I was protecting myself from. His curiosity or my own rising confusion. Everything okay? I asked, my voice trembling slightly as I draped the towel over my shoulder. I tried to appear casual, even though my pulse thundered in my ears. He said, his tone softer now, almost hesitant. I was thinking about what you said the other day, about putting things off. You shouldn't do that. The sudden shift in conversation caught me off guard. I blinked at him, my confusion mounting. What do you mean? He took a step closer, his hand sliding into his pockets as if to appear nonchalant. I mean, you're always putting everyone else first, Aunt Lucy. I've been here a week and I see it. You deserve more than that. His words struck a nerve, stirring emotions I wasn't ready to confront. Stephen, that's very sweet, but I've been doing this for years. It's just life, I said, trying to downplay his concern. But it's not fair, he countered, his brow furrowing. You give so much, but what do you get back? When was the last time you did something just for you? I opened my mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. His question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. When had I last done something for myself? My thoughts flickered back to the boxes of paintings in the attic, to the dreams I'd packed away and forgotten. I don't know, I admitted quietly, my eyes dropping to the floor. Stephen stepped closer, and I could feel the warmth of his presence. You should start, he said firmly, his voice low and steady. You deserve to feel alive again. His words, so earnest and heartfelt, sent a pang through me. I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes, and I quickly turned away, brushing them aside. Thank you, Stephen. That means a lot, I said, trying to regain my composure. But as I moved toward the doorway, his hand lightly caught my arm. The touch was gentle, almost hesitant, but it stopped me in my tracks. I turned to look at him, my breath catching at the expression on his face, a mixture of concern and something deeper, something unspoken. Aunt Lucy, he began, his voice trembling slightly, I hope you know how special you are. You're not just my aunt, you're incredible. His words left me momentarily stunned. The raw honesty in his tone was disarming, and I didn't know how to respond. Stephen, I started, but my voice trailed off, the weight of the moment rendering me speechless. Before I could find the words, he released my arm and stepped back, his cheeks flushing. I'm sorry, he said quickly. I didn't mean to make things awkward. I wanted you to know. I gave him a small, shaky smile, my heart still racing. Thank you, Stephen, I said softly. That's very kind of you. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he turned and walked out of the room. I stood there for a long time after he left, my mind spinning with questions and emotions I couldn't quite name. That evening, I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I busied myself with dinner preparations, hoping that the mundane task would distract me from the lingering tension. Tom had called earlier to say he wouldn't be home until late, so it would just be Stephen and me for dinner. When Stephen came into the kitchen, he was back to his usual self, chatty and charming, as if the strange moment earlier had never happened. I felt a flicker of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the nervous energy that still thrummed through me. Smells amazing, he said, leaning against the counter as I stirred a pot of spaghetti sauce. Thanks, I replied, keeping my tone light. It's nothing fancy, just a quick dinner. Well, it beats frozen pizza, he said with a grin, and I couldn't help but laugh. We ate at the small kitchen table, the conversation flowing easily as we talked about his new job and his plans for the future. For a while, it felt like everything was normal, like we were simply family enjoying a meal together. But then, as the conversation lulled, Stephen's gaze drifted to me, and the air grew heavy again. Aunt Lucy, he said softly, his tone serious, can I ask you something? Of course, I said, setting down my fork. What's on your mind? He hesitated, his brow furrowing as if he were trying to find the right words. Are you happy? The question took me by surprise, and I blinked at him, unsure how to respond. What do you mean? I asked cautiously. I mean, are you happy with your life, with Uncle Tom, with everything? His voice was filled with genuine concern, and the vulnerability in his expression made my heart ache. I paused, searching for an answer. I'm content. Life isn't perfect, but it's fine. Stephen shook his head, a frustrated look crossing his face. You deserve more than fine, Aunt Lucy. You deserve to be truly happy. His words hit me like a thunderclap, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The truth I had been avoiding for years rose to the surface, threatening to overwhelm me. Was I happy, or had I simply convinced myself that contentment was enough? I appreciate that, Stephen. I said finally, my voice trembling. But life doesn't always work out the way we want it to. It doesn't mean you have to settle, he said firmly, his gaze unwavering. You deserve more. I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. The intensity of his words, combined with the emotions they stirred in me, was too much to bear. Thank you, I whispered, my voice barely audible. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Stephen retreated to his room, and I stayed in the kitchen, cleaning up long after everything was spotless. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. The next day, the house was unusually quiet. Stephen had left early for work, and Tom hadn't come home until well past midnight. I used the stillness to collect my thoughts, but the silence was far from soothing. My mind replayed Stephen's words from the night before, his earnest tone, the way his eyes seemed to pierce through every carefully constructed wall I'd built around myself. Are you happy? The question echoed relentlessly, forcing me to confront truths I wasn't ready to admit. I busied myself with chores, hoping to distract myself. By mid-afternoon, I found myself back in the attic, sifting through the remnants of my old life. The paintings stared back at me like forgotten promises, each stroke of color a reminder of the dreams I had abandoned. Why did I stop? I muttered to myself, holding up a canvas. It was a landscape I had painted years ago, the vibrant hues of a sunset blending into the shadows of a forest. It felt like another lifetime, a version of me that no longer existed. I was so lost in thought that I didn't hear Stephen come in. His voice startled me. Aunt Lucy? What are you doing up here? He asked, climbing the stairs. He was still in his work clothes, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. I quickly wiped a tear from my cheek and turned to face him. Just going through some old things, I said, trying to sound casual. Stephen walked over and picked up one of the paintings. He studied it for a moment before looking at me. These are incredible, he said, his voice filled with awe. Why are they just sitting up here collecting dust? I shrugged, avoiding his gaze. Life got busy, I didn't have time. You should make time, he said firmly, setting the painting down. This is a part of you, Aunt Lucy. You can't just ignore it. His words, so simple yet so profound, struck a chord in me. I felt my defenses crumbling under the weight of his sincerity. Maybe, I said softly, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Stephen stepped closer, his presence commanding my attention. You're always putting everyone else first, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. But you need to take care of yourself too. The intensity in his eyes made my heart race. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, I found myself staring at him, unable to look away. For a moment, the air between us felt charged, electric. I could feel the tension building, a dangerous current pulling us closer together. I forced myself to break the silence. Exhale. I should get back to cleaning, I said, my voice shaky. I turned away, desperate to escape the moment. But Stephen didn't move. Aunt Lucy, he said softly, and I could hear the hesitation in his voice. Can I say something? I froze, my back still turned to him. Of course, I said, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. There was a long pause before he spoke. You mean so much to me, he said, his voice trembling. More than you probably realize. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of emotions crash over me, confusion, fear, and something I couldn't quite name. I turned to face him, my hands gripping the edge of a box for support. Stephen, I began, but he held up a hand, stopping me. I know this is complicated, he said, his words careful, but I can't pretend I don't feel something. I've tried to push it away, but it's there. I stared at him, stunned, My mind raced, searching for the right thing to say, but nothing seemed adequate. This isn't right, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I know, he said quickly, his expression pained, and I'm not trying to make things harder for you. I needed you to know. The weight of his confession hung in the air, suffocating and impossible to ignore. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, and I looked away, ashamed of the emotions stirring within me. We can't, I said, my voice breaking. It's not something we can ever act on. I know, he said again, his voice filled with resignation. But it doesn't change how I feel. The silence that followed was unbearable. I couldn't bring myself to look at him, afraid of what I might see in his eyes. Finally, he took a step back, the movement breaking the spell that had held us both captive. I'm sorry, he said softly. I didn't mean to make things awkward. I shook my head, unable to speak. He turned and walked back down the stairs, leaving me alone in the attic with the ghosts of my past and the storm of emotions raging inside me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day in my mind. Stephen's words, his confession, had opened a door I wasn't sure I could close. When Tom came home, I pretended to be asleep, unable to face him. The guilt gnawed at me, a constant reminder of the line I had nearly crossed. I told myself I would talk to Stephen in the morning, set boundaries, and make it clear that nothing could ever happen between us. But deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. The connection I felt with Stephen, as wrong as it was, couldn't be easily dismissed. It was a tangled web of emotions, and I was caught in the middle, unsure of how to find my way out. As I drifted into a restless sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change and not for the better. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping outside my window, their cheerful melody a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything that had transpired over the past few days. I had always prided myself on being in control, on making the right choices. But now, that control felt like it was slipping away, piece by piece. I resolved to confront Stephen. We couldn't go on like this, dancing around unspoken feelings and skirting the edges of boundaries that should never be crossed. It wasn't just for his sake or mine. It was for the family, for the trust that bound us all together. If I didn't put a stop to this, the consequences could be devastating. As I made my way downstairs, I rehearsed what I would say, but when I stepped into the kitchen, my resolve faltered. Stephen was already there, standing at the counter with a mug of coffee in hand. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "No, it is morning," he said, his tone neutral. "Good morning," I replied, forcing a smile. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could feel my carefully planned words slipping away. Stephen gestured toward the coffee pot. I made a fresh pot. "Want some?" "Sure," I said, grateful for the distraction. I poured myself a cup and took a seat at the table, the silence stretching between us like an invisible wall. Stephen sat across from me, his fingers drumming lightly against the mug. Finally, he broke the silence. "About yesterday, I just want to say I'm sorry." I looked up at him, startled. "Stephen?" "No, let me finish," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "I shouldn't have said anything. I was out of line, and I don't want you to feel uncomfortable in your own home. That's the last thing I want." His sincerity disarmed me, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "It's okay," I said finally, though my voice wavered. "I appreciate you saying that, but we need to be clear. Nothing like that can happen again." "I know," he said, nodding. I get it. I needed to get it off my chest. But it's over now. I studied his face, searching for any lingering tension or unspoken emotions, but all I saw was a quiet resolve. Good, I said, though the word felt hollow. We can move past this. He gave me a small smile, and for the first time in days I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could put this behind us. Maybe we could go back to the way things were before. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Stephen went out to meet friends, and I threw myself into housework, desperate for any distraction. By the time Tom came home that evening, I felt like I had finally regained some sense of normalcy. We ate dinner together, the three of us, and for a while it almost felt like a normal family gathering. Tom talked about work, Stephen shared stories from his day, and I smiled and nodded in all the right places. But underneath the surface, I could feel the cracks, the unspoken truths that threatened to unravel everything. After dinner, Tom retreated to his study, leaving Stephen and me to clear the table. As we worked side by side, the air between us felt different. Lighter, almost. We exchanged small talk, avoiding any mention of the past few days, and for a moment, I let myself believe that things might actually be okay. But then, as I handed Stephen a stack of plates, our hands brushed. The contact was brief, barely more than a fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt through me. I saw it in his eyes too, the spark, the unspoken connection that neither of us could deny. I pulled my hand back quickly, my cheeks flushing. "Sorry," I muttered, avoiding his gaze. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "Exhale." We finished cleaning up in silence, the tension simmering just below the surface. When we were done, I excused myself and went upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. Later that night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling once again. Tom was sound asleep beside me, his soft snores filling the room. I envied his ability to drift off so easily, to find peace in the midst of chaos. For me, sleep felt impossible. I couldn't stop thinking about Stephen, the way his eyes lingered on mine, the spark that had passed between us in the kitchen. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew the truth. There was something between us, something that couldn't be ignored. I sat up, unable to stay in bed any longer. Pulling on a robe, I made my way downstairs, hoping a cup of tea would calm my restless mind. But as I stepped into the kitchen, I froze. Stephen was there, sitting at the table with a glass of water in front of him. He looked up as I entered, his expression a mix of surprise and something else, something I couldn't quite name. It was plain to him that his work was hurting me. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his voice low. "No," I said, my throat dry. "Just too much on my mind." He nodded, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Want to talk about it?" I hesitated, then sat down, pulling my robe tighter around me. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, though the words felt like a lie. Stephen studied me for a moment, his gaze steady. "You know that's not true," he said quietly. I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "Stephen, we can't—" "I know," he said quickly, cutting me off. "I'm not trying to push you. I want to make sure you're okay." His concern was genuine, and it made my heart ache. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice betrayed me. "It's just complicated." He nodded, his expression softening. "I get it, and I don't want to make things harder for you. I care about you, Aunt Lucy, more than I probably should." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I felt tears prick my eyes, and I quickly wiped them away. "I care about you too, Stephen, I said softly. But we can't let this go any further. I know, he said, his voice filled with quiet resignation. I don't want to lose you. You won't, I promised, though I wasn't sure how I could keep that promise. We'll get through this. Together. He nodded, and for a moment we sat in silence, the unspoken emotions between us a fragile thread. As I stood to leave, he reached out and lightly touched my hand. "Good night, Aunt Lucy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good night, Stephen," I replied, my heart aching as I walked away. The next morning felt impossibly heavy. I went about my routine as though nothing had happened, but every small sound, the clinking of dishes, the hum of the coffee machine, seemed unnaturally loud, amplifying the tension that still lingered from the night before. I avoided Stephen as best as I could, opting to stay busy in the garden while he spent most of the morning on a video call in his room. By midday, I thought I'd successfully navigated the awkwardness between us. That is, until Stephen appeared in the doorway of the garden shed, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed. His presence startled me, causing me to drop the pruning shears I'd been holding. "Sorry," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I didn't mean to scare you." "It's fine," I replied quickly, bending to pick up the shears. "I was just focused." He stepped inside the shed, his tall frame filling the small space. "We should talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I sighed, setting the shears down on a nearby workbench. "Stephen, I thought we already talked." "Not really," he said, stepping closer. "We danced around it, but we didn't really say what we need to say." I met his gaze, my heart pounding in my chest. "What more is there to say? You know how I feel about this. We can't feel this way," he interrupted, his voice firm. "But we do, and ignoring it doesn't make it go away." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I turned away, unable to face him. "It doesn't matter how we feel," I said quietly. "What matters is doing the right thing." "And what's the right thing?" he asked, stepping closer. "Pretending we don't feel anything? Pretending we're not connected?" I closed my eyes, willing myself to stay strong. "Yes," I said firmly, "because anything else would destroy this family." He was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was filled with quiet resignation. "I don't want to hurt you, Aunt Lucy. I don't know how to stop feeling this way." His vulnerability broke something in me, and before I could stop myself, I turned to face him. "Stephen, I care about you more than I can say," I said, my voice trembling. "But we can't let this consume us. It will ruin everything." He nodded slowly, his expression pained. "I know," he said, "but it doesn't make it any easier." I reached out and placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of comfort that felt both necessary and dangerous. "We'll figure this out," I said softly. "But we have to be strong." The days that followed were a delicate balancing act. Stephen and I avoided being alone together, a silent agreement to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Tom, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension, seemed grateful for the harmony in the house. But the distance between Stephen and me only amplified the emotions simmering beneath the surface. Every stolen glance, every accidental touch felt charged with meaning, a silent reminder of the line we were desperately trying not to cross. One evening, Tom announced that he would be heading out of town for a work conference. The news sent a jolt of panic through me. Stephen and I would be alone in the house for 3 days. I forced a smile, nodding along as Tom detailed his itinerary, but my mind raced with worry. The night before Tom's departure, I stayed up late, unable to sleep. I sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the darkened yard. The sound of the screen door creaking open made me jump, and I turned to see Stephen stepping outside. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, pulling the blanket tighter around me. Just too much on my mind." He took a seat beside me, the wooden chair creaking under his weight. For a while we sat in silence, the only sound the chirping of crickets in the distance. "Weird Uncle Tom's gone," Stephen began cautiously. "Do you think it'll be weird, us being here alone?" The honesty of his question caught me off guard. "It doesn't have to be," I said carefully. "As long as we're careful." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "I'll do my best," he said quietly. "I just don't want to make things harder for you." "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That means a lot." We fell silent again, the weight of unspoken emotions pressing down on us. Eventually, Stephen stood and placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of reassurance that sent a shiver down my spine. "Good night, Aunt Lucy," he said softly, before disappearing back into the house. The next day, after Tom left, I threw myself into housework, determined to keep busy. Stephen spent most of the morning in his room, giving me space, but by the afternoon he joined me in the kitchen. "Need any help?" he asked, his tone light. I hesitated before nodding. "Sure, you can chop those vegetables." We worked side by side, the rhythm of the task offering a strange sense of normalcy. For a while, it felt like everything was fine, like we were just family members sharing a quiet afternoon. But as the sun began to set, the tension returned. Stephen leaned against the counter, watching me as I stirred a pot of soup. His gaze lingered a moment too long, and I felt my heart quicken. "What?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Nothing," he said, though his expression betrayed him. You look really happy when you're cooking." "It suits you." His compliment caught me off guard, and I felt a blush rise to my cheeks. "Thank you," I said softly, turning back to the stove. The silence that followed was heavy, and I could feel him watching me. Finally, I turned to face him, my resolve faltering under the intensity of his gaze. "Stephen, we can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. "We have to find a way to move past it." "I know," he said, stepping closer, "but it's harder than I thought it would be." His proximity sent a jolt through me, and I took a step back, gripping the edge of the counter for support. "You should go," I said, my voice shaking. "We need space." He nodded slowly, his expression filled with regret. "I'll go for a walk," he said quietly. "Give us both some time to think." As he left the kitchen, I felt a wave of relief mixed with guilt. I knew we were walking a dangerous path, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold myself together. The house felt eerily quiet after Stephen left. I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring out the window into the darkening evening, trying to calm the storm inside me. His words, his presence, they lingered in the room even after he was gone. I took a deep breath and decided to focus on anything else. I grabbed a book from the shelf, poured myself a glass of wine, and curled up on the couch. But as much as I tried to lose myself in the pages, my mind kept wandering back to Stephen. The way his eyes lingered on mine, the sincerity in his voice, it was as though he saw a version of me that no one else did. The sound of the front door opening jolted me back to reality. Stephen had returned from his walk, his footsteps soft as he moved through the house. I stayed still, unsure if I should acknowledge him or pretend I was engrossed in my book. "Hey," he said softly, standing in the doorway of the living room. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "Oh, "You're not," I replied, setting the book down. "Did you have a good walk?" He nodded, stepping further into the room. "Yeah, gave me some time to think." I nodded, unsure of what to say. The weight of the past few days hung heavily between us, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Stephen hesitated before sitting on the opposite end of the couch. "Aunt Lucy," he began, his voice careful, "I don't want to keep making things difficult for you." "You're not," I said quickly, though the words felt like a lie. He shook his head. "I am, and I know it's not fair to you." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension was thick, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, I forced myself to break the silence. "Stephen, I think we both need some space," I said gently, "just to clear our heads." His expression fell, but he nodded. "Maybe you're right," he said softly. I'll head back to my apartment tomorrow." The words hit me harder than I expected. The thought of him leaving, of not seeing him every day, filled me with a strange mix of relief and sadness. "If that's what you think is best," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I do," he said, though his tone was uncertain. "I think it's what we need." The next morning was quiet, the weight of Stephen's impending departure hanging over the house. I stayed busy with chores, avoiding the inevitable goodbye. By the time he came downstairs with his bags packed, I felt a lump forming in my throat. "Thanks for letting me stay," he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "It really meant a lot to me." "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "You're always welcome here." He hesitated, his gaze lingering on mine. "Take care of yourself, Aunt Lucy. And don't forget what I said. You deserve to be happy." His words brought tears to my eyes, but I blinked them away. "Thank you, Stephen. That means a lot." With that, he gave me a quick hug and walked out the door. I stood in the doorway, watching as he loaded his bags into his car and drove away. The silence that followed was deafening, and I felt an ache in my chest that I couldn't quite explain. In the days that followed, life returned to its usual rhythm, or at least I tried to convince myself that it had. Tom came home from his conference, oblivious to the turmoil that had unfolded in his absence. I threw myself into my routine, hoping to bury the lingering emotions that Stephen had stirred. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the distractions were gone, my thoughts always drifted back to him. I replayed our conversations, his earnest expressions, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was a dangerous nostalgia, one that I knew I couldn't indulge. A week later, Stephen called. The sight of his name on my phone screen sent a jolt through me, and I hesitated before answering. "Stephen," I said, my voice betraying my surprise, "how are you?" "I'm good," he said, his tone warm. "I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing." "I'm fine," I replied, though the word felt hollow. "How about you?" "I'm okay," he said, his voice quieter now. "It's been weird not being there." "I know what you mean," I admitted, my heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I miss you, Aunt Lucy." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I struggled to find the right response. "I miss you too," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I just wanted you to know that," he said softly, "but I'll let you go. Take care of yourself, okay?" "You too," I said, my throat tight. "Take care, Stephen." As the call ended, I felt a wave of emotions crash over me. Relief, sadness, and a lingering sense of longing that I couldn't quite shake. The days turned into weeks, and slowly the intensity of my feelings began to fade. I poured my energy into rediscovering my old passions, spending hours in the attic painting landscapes that felt like an escape from the chaos of my mind. It was a small step, but it gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Holding my breath, I let my thoughts settle upon my work. Stephen and I kept in touch, our conversations light and casual, carefully avoiding the subject of what had passed between us. It was an unspoken agreement, a way to preserve the bond we had without crossing the line again. And yet, every now and then, I would catch myself thinking of him, his smile, his laughter, the way he made me feel alive. It was a bittersweet memory, one that I knew I would carry with me for a long time. Life gradually settled into a rhythm again, though it was a rhythm marked by the absence of Stephen. I threw myself into my painting, finding solace in the quiet hours spent in the attic. Each brushstroke felt like a small act of reclaiming myself, a way to pour the emotions I couldn't voice into something tangible. Tom seemed oblivious to the shift in me, though I couldn't tell if that was because he was too busy or because he had long since stopped paying close attention. His long hours at work and frequent trips left me alone with my thoughts more often than not, and I found myself craving connection in ways I hadn't before. Stephen's phone calls came sporadically, and though they were friendly and casual, there was always a sense of something unspoken between us. We both avoided addressing the tension that had defined his visit, choosing instead to focus on surface-level updates about work, hobbies, and life in general. It was a fragile balance, one I clung to for fear of tipping it too far in either direction. One Friday evening, several weeks after Stephen had left, I was in the middle of cleaning up after dinner when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Tom hadn't mentioned company. Wiping my hands on a dish towel, I made my way to the door, my curiosity piqued. When I opened it, I froze. Stephen stood on the porch, his hands shoved into his pockets, a sheepish smile on his face. "Stephen," I said, my voice a mix of surprise and something I couldn't quite place. "What are you doing here?" "I was in the area for work," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Thought I'd stop by and say hello." My heart raced as I stepped aside to let him in. "Tom's not home," I said, as if that fact needed clarification. "That's okay," he said, his smile faltering slightly. "I wanted to see you." The weight of his words hung in the air, and I struggled to keep my composure. "Well, it's good to see you," I said, forcing a smile. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Tea?" "Just water is fine," he said, following me into the kitchen. I busied myself at the sink, grateful for the excuse to avoid looking at him. When I turned to hand him the glass, his gaze was already on me, and the intensity of it made my breath catch. "You're painting again," he said, nodding toward the smudges of color still on my hands. "Yes," I said, glancing down at them. "I've been spending a lot of time in the attic. It's been nice." "I'm glad," he said, his voice soft. "I knew you'd find your way back to it." The sincerity in his words made my chest tighten, and I looked away, unsure of how to respond. "So, how's work?" I asked, desperate to change the subject. "It's fine," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Busy. But I've been thinking about taking some time off." "Oh," I said, raising an eyebrow. "What for?" "To figure things out," he said simply, "to figure out what I really want." The double meaning in his words wasn't lost on me, and I felt a familiar pang of both dread and longing. "That sounds like a good idea," I said carefully. "Sometimes it helps to step back and reassess." He nodded, his gaze steady. "That's part of why I came here, to reassess." My pulse quickened and I set the glass down on the counter, needing something to do with my hands. "Stephen?" "I know," he said quickly, holding up a hand. "I'm not here to make things harder for you. I just needed to see you, to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," I said, though my voice wavered. "I've been keeping busy." "I can see that," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "But I also know you, Aunt Lucy. You don't always say what you're really feeling." His observation hit too close to home, and I felt the walls I'd carefully built over the past few weeks begin to crumble. "Stephen, I can't do this," I said, my voice breaking. "It's too much." "I'm not asking for anything," he said, stepping closer. I miss you." The vulnerability in his voice was like a knife to my heart, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. "I miss you too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But that doesn't mean this is right." "I know," he said softly, "but it doesn't make it any easier." For a moment we stood there in silence, the air between us thick with everything we couldn't say. I wanted to tell him to leave, to protect both of us from the inevitable fallout, but I also couldn't bring myself to let him go. The sound of Tom's car pulling into the driveway broke the spell. I stepped back quickly, wiping at my eyes as Stephen turned toward the door. "I should go," he said, his voice tinged with regret, "but I'm glad I came." "Me too," I said, though the words felt heavy with contradiction. He gave me one last look before slipping out the back door, disappearing into the evening just as Tom walked in through the front. I plastered on a smile, greeting my husband as if nothing had happened, but my mind was already elsewhere. Over the next few days, Stephen's visit lingered in my thoughts. I told myself it was for the best that he'd left so quickly, that his absence was what I needed to regain my footing. But the truth was harder to admit. I missed him. I missed the way he saw me, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I knew I couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between what I wanted and what was right. Something had to give, and I wasn't sure I was ready for the consequences. The days following Stephen's visit were an emotional tug-of-war. On the surface, I carried on as if nothing had changed, running errands, cleaning the house, cooking meals. But beneath it all, my thoughts were consumed by him. Every quiet moment seemed to echo with his words, his presence, the unresolved tension that lingered between us. Tom, oblivious to my inner turmoil, spent his evenings glued to his work emails. The quiet companionship we once shared had dissolved into a routine of distant familiarity. I told myself that this was normal after so many years of marriage, that it was natural to drift apart in small ways. But now, in the wake of Stephen's unexpected confession, that distance felt like a chasm, and the tension felt like a crush, and the tension sent. A week later, I was in the attic, finishing a painting I'd been working on for days. The colors swirled together, chaotic and vibrant, a reflection of the emotions I couldn't seem to untangle. I stepped back to survey my work, wiping paint-streaked hands on an old rag, when my phone buzzed on the nearby table. I hesitated before picking it up. Stephen's name lit up the screen. "Hi," I answered, my voice tinged with caution. "Hey, Aunt Lucy," he said, his tone light but tentative. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "No, not at all," I said quickly, though my heart was already racing. "I've been thinking about you," he said after a pause. "About what you said, that we need space." I closed my eyes, bracing myself. "Stephen, I meant what I said. It's better this way." "I know," he said, his voice soft. "But I can't stop thinking about you. I know it's wrong, but I don't know how to let it go." The raw honesty in his voice left me momentarily speechless. I sank into an old chair, gripping the phone tightly. "Stephen, we can't keep doing this," I said finally. "It's not fair to either of us." "I know," he said again. "But I miss you, Aunt Lucy. I miss the way we used to talk, the way you looked at me when you were happy. I feel like I lost something important when I left." His words cut through me, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. "You didn't lose anything," I said, though my voice wavered. "I'm still here, but we have to keep our boundaries, Stephen, for both our sakes." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I understand," he said finally, though his tone was heavy with resignation. I needed you to know how I feel." "Thank you," I said softly, my heart aching. "But we need to move forward, both of us." "I'll try," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Take care, Aunt Lucy." You too," I replied, my throat tight. As the call ended, I set the phone down and leaned back in the chair, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. I knew I had done the right thing, but the ache in my chest made it hard to breathe. That evening, I sat across from Tom at the dinner table, watching him scroll through his phone between bites of food. The sight of him, so detached and unaware, filled me with a strange mix of anger and sadness. "Tom?" I said suddenly, breaking the silence. He looked up, startled. "Yeah?" "Do you ever think about us?" I asked, my voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "About how we've changed?" He frowned, setting his phone down. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we don't talk like we used to. We don't spend time together. It feels like we're just coexisting." Tom sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Lucy, it's been a long day. Can we talk about this another time?" "No," I said firmly, surprising even myself. "We need to talk about it now." He stared at me for a moment, then shrugged. "Fine. What do you want me to say?" "We've been married for a long time, Lucy. Things aren't always going to feel exciting. That's just how it is." His words stung, though I wasn't sure what response I had been hoping for. "That's not enough for me, Tom," I said, my voice trembling. "I want more. I deserve more." "More?" he asked, his tone defensive. "What are you saying, that you're unhappy?" "Yes," I said, the truth spilling out before I could stop it. "I'm unhappy, Tom, and I have been for a long time." He stared at me, his expression a mix of confusion and frustration. "I don't understand," he said finally. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to care," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I want you to notice me, to see me." Tom was silent, his brow furrowed as he looked down at his plate. "I didn't realize," he began, but his voice trailed off. "That's the problem," I said, standing up from the table. "You didn't realize. And now? I don't know if it's too late." I left the room before he could respond, retreating to the sanctuary of the attic. There, surrounded by my paintings and the quiet solace of the space, I let the tears come. Over the next few days, Tom made a noticeable effort to bridge the gap between us. He started coming home earlier, asking about my day, even sitting with me while I painted. It was a small step, but it gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. But even as I focused on rebuilding my marriage, a part of me still longed for the connection I had felt with Stephen. It was a longing I couldn't shake, a reminder of the person I had been before life and routine dulled my edges. I knew the path forward wouldn't be easy, but I also knew I had to choose it. For myself, for Tom, for Stephen. It was the only way to heal the fractures in my life and find the happiness I so desperately craved. The following weeks were a haze of half-hearted attempts at repairing what was left of my marriage. Tom, to his credit, tried in small, awkward ways to reconnect, bringing home flowers one evening, suggesting a dinner out on another. But his efforts felt performative, as though he were checking items off a list rather than addressing the deeper issues between us. I played along, smiling at the right moments, laughing when the situation called for it, but inside I felt hollow. The warmth that had once defined our relationship had been replaced by an unspoken understanding. We were two people bound by years of shared history, but little else. And then there was Stephen. No matter how much I tried to focus on Tom and the life we had built together, thoughts of Stephen continued to creep in, unbidden and relentless. I hadn't heard from him since our last phone call, and the silence was both a relief and a source of constant ache. I told myself that it was for the best. That distance was the only way to untangle the web of emotions between us, but the longing never truly faded. One evening, as I was putting away laundry, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I hesitated before picking it up, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Stephen's name on the screen. My fingers hovered over the answer button for a moment before I finally pressed it. "Hello?" I said, my voice steady despite the flutter in my chest. "Hi, Aunt Lucy," Stephen said, his tone warm but cautious. "I hope this isn't a bad time." "No, not at all," I said quickly, setting the laundry aside. "How are you?" "I'm okay," he said, though his voice carried a weight that suggested otherwise. "I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing." "I'm fine," I said, though the word felt like a lie. "Keeping busy, and you?" "Same," he said. There was a pause before he added, "I miss talking to you." His words sent a pang through me, and I swallowed hard. "I miss talking to you too," I admitted, my voice soft. "I know I said I'd give you space," he said, his tone apologetic. "But I couldn't stop thinking about you. I needed to hear your voice." "Stephen?" I began, but my words faltered. What could I say that I hadn't already said? That this was wrong? That we needed to let go? I had said it all before, and yet the feelings persisted. "I know we can't go back," he said quietly, "but I don't know how to move forward without you in my life." His vulnerability left me breathless, and I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself. "I don't either," I admitted, the truth slipping out before I could stop it. "But we have to figure it out, for both our sakes." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and I could hear him exhale softly. "I just want you to be happy, Aunt Lucy," he said finally. "That's all I've ever wanted." "Thank you," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. "That means more to me than you know." We ended the call shortly after, and I sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I knew I had to make a choice, a real choice, not just for myself, but for everyone involved. The next morning, I woke with a sense of clarity that had eluded me for weeks. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between two worlds. It wasn't fair to Tom, to Stephen, or to myself. I needed to face the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. I waited until Tom came home that evening, sitting him down at the kitchen table with a seriousness that immediately caught his attention. "Lucy," he said, his brow furrowed, "what's going on?" "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "About us, about where we are." His expression softened, and he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Okay, I'm listening." I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "I've been unhappy for a long time, Tom, and I think you have too. We've been going through the motions, but it's not enough. We're not enough. His face fell, and I saw a flicker of pain in his eyes. I didn't realize it was that bad, he said quietly. It is, I said, my voice breaking. I don't blame you. I don't even blame us. But we've grown apart, and I don't know if we can fix it. Tom was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the table. Finally, he nodded. I've felt it too, he admitted. I just didn't want to say it out loud. Tears streamed down my face as I reached across the table, taking his hand in mine. I still care about you, Tom. I always will. But maybe it's time for us to let go. He looked at me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Maybe you're right, he said softly. But it doesn't make it any easier. No, I agreed. It doesn't. Over the next few weeks, Tom and I began the process of untangling our lives. It was painful and messy, but it was also necessary. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of liberation, a chance to rediscover who I was outside the confines of our marriage. I didn't reach out to Stephen during that time, though he remained in my thoughts. I needed to find my own footing before I could even begin to think about what might come next. And then, one quiet evening, as I sat in the attic surrounded by my paintings, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Stephen. I hope you're okay. I'm thinking about you. I stared at the words for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I typed a reply. Okay, I've made some changes. I hope you're okay too. His response came almost immediately. I am now. As I set the phone down, a small, tentative smile crossed my face. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of hope, a possibility of something new, something different. The future was uncertain, but for the first time I was ready to face it. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. Tom moved out into a modest apartment closer to his office, and we amicably divided our belongings. The house, now quieter than ever, became my sanctuary, a place where I could finally focus on rediscovering myself. I spent countless hours painting in the attic, the vibrant colors on the canvas reflecting the kaleidoscope of emotions I felt. It wasn't always easy. Some days the weight of uncertainty felt unbearable. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was breathing freely, unencumbered by the expectations that had defined my life for so long. Stephen stayed at the periphery of my world during this time. We exchanged occasional messages, brief, lighthearted notes that hinted at deeper emotions, but avoided revisiting the tension that had once defined us. I wasn't ready to confront what lay between us, and I sensed that he was giving me the space I needed. His flight upstairs made me feel safe, and I sensed that he was giving me the space I needed. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the house, there was a knock at the door. My heart leapt as I opened it to find Stephen standing there, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. "Hi," he said, his smile tentative but warm. "Hi," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," he said, glancing around the familiar space. "But I was in town and thought I'd stop by." He followed me into the living room where the smell of fresh paint lingered in the air. His eyes landed on an unfinished canvas propped against the wall, and his smile grew. "You've been busy," he said, nodding toward the painting. "It's been therapeutic," I admitted, sitting down on the couch. "It's helped me process everything." He sat down beside me, leaving a comfortable distance between us. "I'm glad," he said, his tone sincere. "You seem lighter." "I feel lighter," I said, meeting his gaze. For the first time in a long time, we sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. Finally, Stephen spoke, his voice soft but steady. "I've missed you," he said simply. "I've missed you too," I replied, my voice trembling. But I didn't want to complicate things. I needed time to figure out who I am without everything else. "I understand," he said, his expression earnest. "I've been trying to do the same." I studied him, noticing the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence, the maturity that seemed to have deepened since the last time we'd seen each other. "How's that going?" I asked, a small smile tugging at my lips. "It's a work in progress," he admitted with a chuckle, "but I'm getting there." We talked for hours, the conversation flowing easily as we caught up on everything we'd missed. It felt natural, effortless, as though we were reclaiming the bond we'd shared before everything became so complicated. As the evening wore on, the air between us shifted. Stephen's gaze lingered on mine a moment too long, and I felt the familiar pull that I had spent so many weeks trying to resist. My heart raced, but I forced myself to speak. "Stephen, I don't know where this goes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm still figuring things out." "So am I," he said softly. "But I know how I feel, and I'm willing to wait until you're ready." His words sent a wave of emotion crashing over me, and I felt tears prick my eyes. "This isn't easy," I said, my voice trembling. "There's so much to consider." "I know," he said, reaching out to take my hand in his, "but we don't have to have all the answers right now. We can take it one step at a time." His touch was gentle, reassuring, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of hope that I hadn't felt in years. "Okay," I said finally, my voice steady. "One step at a time." The months that followed were a delicate dance of discovery and restraint. Stephen and I continued to build our connection, careful not to rush or let the weight of our past overshadow the present. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, of guilt, of fear about what others might think. But there were also moments of pure, unfiltered joy, moments that reminded me why I had taken the risk to rebuild my life. And I continued painting, finding new inspiration in the person I was becoming. Stephen became my confidant, my muse, and my partner in navigating the complexities of our situation. Together we found a rhythm that felt right for us, even if it didn't fit the expectations of the world around us. One evening, as we sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Stephen turned to me, his expression serious. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, his voice steady, "but I know that I want you to be a part of it." Tears filled my eyes as I reached for his hand. "I want that too," I said, my voice breaking. "Whatever that looks like." In that moment, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in years. The path ahead was uncertain, but I was no longer afraid. For the first time, I was living a life that felt true to who I was, a life filled with love, hope, and the promise of something beautiful.